An Israeli video apparently shows Hamas fighters surrendering and handing over weapons in Gaza. But critics are dismissing it as staged and part of Israeli propaganda. So is the footage real or fake? And who gains or loses by circulating it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. Propaganda as a tool of war is a strategy that has been used for years. The war in Gaza is no different. Both sides have been accused of spreading disinformation. A video is circulating in Israeli media which purports to show the surrender of some Hamas fighters. But critics say it is staged and they've cast doubt on its authenticity. The footage comes as Hamas continues to resist Israel's relentless assault more than 9 weeks into the conflict. And Israel faces growing global condemnation for killing Palestinian civilians as the death toll reaches 18,000 people killed. So, is the video an attempt by Israel to deflect accusations of genocide in Gaza? And is it real or fake? We'll discuss all this, but first, Fintan Monahan's report looking at the footage and the circumstances leading to its release.
Palestinian men stripped and humiliated by Israeli forces. One man comes forward and hands over a weapon. The Israeli government says these men are Hamas fighters, and that images like this are proof its war in Gaza is succeeding.
In recent days, dozens of Hamas terrorists have surrendered to our forces. They are laying down their weapons and handing themselves over to our heroic fighters.
But many analysts have cast doubt on the video, accusing Israeli forces of staging some elements. Civilians have been identified among the detainees, as have UN staff, aid workers, and at least one journalist. Others point to the choreographed nature of the clip, and, even as a piece of propaganda, its effectiveness has been called into question.
Whatever the Israelis intended to do, it has backfired disastrously bad, regardless of the authenticity of it or not. Because the images that have gone around the world are images that show men and young men and older men stripped down to their underwear. They're forced to kneel on the ground. They have their hands tied behind them. What does that remind people of? So it reminds people of ISIS. It reminds people of Abu Ghraib. It reminds people of brutality.
Israel is frequently accused of spreading misinformation. The army maintained these images show large numbers of fighters surrendering to Israeli troops. But Israeli media later reported that only around 1 in 10 had links to Hamas. This video shows an Israeli military spokesman alleging a piece of paper on a wall was a list of names of Hamas members guarding Israeli captives. It turned out to be a list of the days of the week. And in early December, a military spokesman said one Hamas fighter was being killed for every 2 civilians in Gaza, a number many analysts find difficult to believe, especially given the number of children killed. Israel is waging an information war to win support for its military campaign in Gaza. But as that offensive drags on, it's facing increasing criticism on the international stage and growing impatience at home. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C. is Sahar Khamis, a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and a specialist on Arab and Muslim media. Sahar, we'll come to you in just a moment. In Doha is Marc Owen Jones, an associate professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. You research how technology can be used as a tool of oppression. And from London, we are joined by Dina Matar, a professor of political communication and Arab media at the Center for Global Media and Communication at SOAS, that is the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Sahar, let me start with you. I'd like your take on this video, and it was in Fintan's report. This is the video where we see dozens of Palestinian men stripped to their underwear, one of them, whom Al Jazeera reporters in Gaza have since identified as an aluminum shop worker who is made to walk, follow Israeli instructions, and put down weapons in front of them. What did you think when you first saw this video?
Well, thank you for having me. I think that there is a famous saying that truth is the biggest victim of war. So whenever you have war, you also have some accompanying degree of propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. And this has been very prevalent and very clearly spread in the current situation in Gaza and the horrific attack on Gaza. It is not the first time that we see footage that cannot be documented, cannot be really verified as accurate. And I think that in this particular case, there is a lot of doubt about the authenticity and verification of this particular footage and this particular video, because indeed some of the people who showed up in this particular video were found to be civilians, whether they are just average citizens or even a journalist or other people who have no affiliation with Hamas. And let me just say that this is not the first time that we have seen this type of disinformation and even staged videos emerge out of this particular situation. We all remember the case of the staged video of the woman who posed as a nurse from Al-Shifa hospital, and she started to say things like, oh, Hamas is using, the Al-Shifa hospital as a place to actually have its own military command center, and it's stealing food and fuel and resources and energy from the Palestinian civilians and doing horrific things. And then this whole video turned out to be staged and fake, and there was no proof whatsoever that this woman was a nurse or that she was at Al-Shifa hospital, and the whole thing was completely fake. So unfortunately, we have been seeing that time and time again in the midst of this horrific attack on Gaza, and disinformation and propaganda has been used as a brutal weapon in this particular terrible situation.
Marc Owen Jones, referring back to that video, again, the one where this Palestinian man surrenders a weapon, what is the audience? Who's the audience for this, for pictures like these?
Well, I think the audience is primarily the Israeli public. But I would like to add what was a crucial aspect of that video that we need to explain is that firstly, one of the iconic photographs was showing the man holding the gun in his right hand, surrendering it, and putting that gun on a pile of other guns, right? And then what later emerged on social media was a video where you saw the same man walking and holding his gun in the left hand, right? Which led to obvious accusations that this had been staged and that the man was repeatedly asked to come and put guns down for the camera. And there's even a voice of a soldier off camera who's saying, please put the gun that we gave you down, right? So I just wanted to emphasize that point that people have talked about this video being staged, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it was staged and that they made a man who had already been stripped to his underwear carry weapons for the purposes of a photo shoot. So I think the purpose of that video, one, is humiliation. There's no real reason why they should be stripped to their underwear and photographed. Let's not forget that it's seen as a contravention of the Geneva Convention to publicly humiliate and degrade prisoners of war. And if you photograph those prisoners, you are degrading them. So to engage in that kind of behavior and then publish it in a way that goes viral, I would say is designed to humiliate not just Hamas, but Palestinians. As Sahar said, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that these fighters or the people, in the pictures are ordinary people. So I think what's happening here, as the pressure from the US for the war to end increases, Israel are more desperate to convey to their domestic audience that there is some sort of victory here. And the way that they want to do that is to have this mass humiliation of Palestinian men and then publish that to an Israeli audience to sort of demonstrate that there has been sufficient vengeance for what happened on October the 7th.
Dina, Matar, your thoughts on this? Because one could easily argue that this has backfired. This, as other videos have that Israel has released since the beginning of this conflict, there is so much talk on social media, in broadcast news, on this video. And in a similar way, there was a lot of talk on previous videos that Israel has released, and there was just really deep questions, fundamental questions on the authenticity of the videos, whether they were staged, to what extent they were staged, etc. Could one consider that this has backfired and continues to backfire for Israel?
Well, that's a good question. I think I was today looking at the BBC coverage of this particular video, and even the BBC, which has now gone into the practice of verifying and putting the word verify of various videos that come out of the war. It was interesting to see that even in the BBC report, it said there are still questions remaining in terms of the authenticity. There's another point, so the first images of the group of men, or, it's not only a group, it's a couple of hundred men stripped down to their underwear That first image came out, maybe about 4 days ago or even more, and then the video of the man with the gun came back later. So there is the timing element. So the question arises as to why did Israel decide, or Israeli authorities or the IDF decide to publish the image of the man with the gun? There's another issue that I want to raise here, which is, despite the very, the sophistication of Israeli intelligence and Israeli communication practices and their propaganda machine, these videos show a bit of kind of naivety, and in a sense, they are probably images taken by the soldiers themselves of their captives, and then reframed by, that's my assumption, I mean, I don't know whether I'm correct or not, time will tell, is that they have been reframed as part of the Israeli propaganda campaign and the misinformation campaigns that have kind of come up quite a lot during this war against Gaza.
There's something I'd like to put to all of you, is that these videos that we've been, by the way, putting up on screen, of course, as you've been talking, these videos have been referenced by Israeli leadership. We heard Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reference it earlier in that report that Hamas fighters were laying down their weapons. This is Herzi Halevi, the Israeli Chief of General Staff. Listen to him.
I see the achievements from day to day. We are seeing every day terrorists are killed and also terrorists who are injured. In the last few days, we also have seen them surrendering, a sign of the collapse of the system, a sign that we need to press harder. And this is what you are doing.
All right, Sahar, Khamis, so we see there's this kind of feedback loop almost, where the video makes it onto Israeli media. This video, the soundbite that we just aired, was recorded a couple days ago. And then you see the heads of the military or the prime minister saying, we have the video, this shows that our military campaign is working, and it seems that one feeds into the other.
I think that Israel is desperate in order to paint an image of some kind of quote-unquote victory, because that has not really been the case. I mean, it was hoping for some kind of grand operation that would really put Hamas down to its knees in a very short time. And as we all know, that did not happen. The ground operation in Gaza did not go as planned for Israel or as hoped for. And as it loses more and more of its own soldiers and artillery and all of that stuff, it is really desperate in order to show that it is doing some kind of success or some kind of victories being achieved in Gaza. Hence, these kinds of videos that are mostly staged and unverified, as we've been giving examples before. We all know the example, of course, also in Al-Shifa hospital, where the soldiers claimed that Hamas had a command control center under the hospital. And then, of course, there were all of these jokes in, Arab social media posts about the calendar that was shown on the wall and that some Israeli soldier was pointing down to as like, oh, this is like a list of Hamas fighters, when in fact it was just a list of the days of the week. So there were like jokes going on viral on social media saying, be careful. If you're an Arab, don't keep a calendar, because that can really prove that you are somehow associated with Hamas or Hummus. So it has been like, really used in the social media context as some kind of making fun of this type of dangerous disinformation. But it is not only funny, it is really very dangerous, because some people, unfortunately, take these types of disinformation, and it is disinformation, not misinformation, because misinformation happens when you don't get the facts right, but you have a good intention. But disinformation happens, as in these cases, when you deliberately tweak the facts and actually create some kind of fake scenario or fake story that never happened. So this is called disinformation. And that is very dangerous, because unfortunately, some receivers or audiences may not be witty enough, may not be really media literate, and can just take all of that stuff at face value and believe it to be a fact when it's not.
But, even within the Israeli media, if you read Haaretz, for instance, they carried this report with, and they attributed, they quoted senior security officials told Haaretz on Sunday that of the hundreds of Palestinian detainees photographed handcuffed in the Gaza Strip, about 10 to 15% are Hamas operatives or are identified within the organization. Now, simple math tells us that means 85 to 90% of the people that we see in these pictures are not in any way affiliated with Hamas. And the Israeli military say that they've released the others. So it seems that there's the big picture narrative that's being put out, as we said, that by Netanyahu, the heads of the military, and then when they're questioned in detail by the media, they say, well, actually, 90% of these people are not Hamas operatives. So, Marc, this goes back to the question that I was asking you earlier. Who is the intended audience, and what's the purpose if you're then going to say, actually, most of these people were civilians?
Well, again, I think, this isn't just about Hamas. I think what we're seeing here, and I mentioned it earlier, and this notion of, the fact that the men in the photos were stripped down to their underwear. This is about humiliation, right? And it's not just about the act of humiliation. It's the public broadcasting of these images, which makes that humiliation a form of viral humiliation, right? It's about, helping dehumanize Palestinians and othering them. And I think this is another argument of why it's for not just the Israeli audience, but the global audience to an extent. One of the issues we've seen coming out of the past 2 months is this attempt to routinely dehumanize Palestinians. Why is it important to dehumanize them? Well, because if you dehumanize them, and we've seen lots of discourse like this from, for example, an Israeli official referring to Palestinians as human animals, if people are encouraged to see Palestinians as less than human, they'll be more likely to support continued, not just Israeli action against Palestinians, but increasingly horrible treatment of Israelis, of Palestinians, right? And this narrative of dehumanization is contributing to this. So I think this photo of Palestinians was an attempt at dehumanization to further basically legitimize continued Israeli attacks on them. And I use this kind of example of the audience, right? Some people say, well, why this disinformation often seems so flimsy, or the staged elements seem obvious. Well, it's like Israel airstrikes. So Israel are happy to kill 100 civilians if it means they're killing one Hamas leader. They're happy to arrest 100 civilians if it means arresting 10 Hamas leaders. But I say the same for disinformation. It doesn't matter if 100 people, critical people, realize that the disinformation is nonsense. As long as 2 or 3 Israelis will believe that disinformation, then it's been successful to an extent.
Dina, there is in Hebrew, and it doesn't have an exact English translation, the concept of Hasbara, which is essentially a communications strategy to explain what the state of Israel is doing. The closest approximation to the Hebrew word Hasbara is explain, right? Explain what Israel is doing. Do you want to explain to our viewers how Israel uses that and has used that in the past?
So Israel has used Hasbara, which is translated into public relations or communication strategies, in very specific and targeted ways. I agree with Marc that the audience for this particular clip we were talking about is the Israeli audience. And in a sense, it's a way of telling them, look, we are taking hostages. And in a sense, it's saying we are also, kind of keeping them and humiliating them. So maybe it's a way of responding to the current debate within Israeli societies, particularly by the family members of hostages in Gaza. But to go back to Hasbara, it's a strategy, a political communication strategy that Israel has been using to try and legitimize its own narrative about itself. In a way, the right to exist, the right to defend itself, kind of locating it within this anti-Semitic frame. Everyone who criticizes Israel is immediately branded as being anti-Semitic. And this Hasbara is targeted at different people and publics. It's not only, it's basically targeted at publics in the West, perhaps in the Arab world as well, to try and, kind of change the perspectives, or perhaps show that, or support Israel in its claims to about itself. And we have seen many examples about that over the years. And it is a very pernicious strategy. And you could see that one of the most important figures who practices it is, of course, Marc, who probably has had training in communication and how to use language. And he insists on using particular terms all the time, denying any possibility of thinking otherwise. So this is what Hasbara is, and it's been written about quite a lot in the literature, in the academic literature, in terms of the literature on propaganda and on strategic communication.
By the way, Marc is an Israeli diplomat, a civil servant, a government advisor, but most TV viewers, especially people who watch news about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they will definitely have seen him in interviews because he speaks, obviously in favor of Israel, but he gives a lot of interviews to explain the Israeli point of view. Outside of Israel, do you feel that for this conflict, Hasbara is working? Because Israel, since October the 7th, has lost a lot of international support. We know how the world feels about this war because there was a resolution at the UN General Assembly. I'm not talking about the one at the Security Council. I'm talking about the General Assembly, which takes the temperature of how all the countries in the world feels. There was an overwhelming majority for a ceasefire and to stop the fighting. Do you feel Hasbara is working outside of Israel for this conflict, for this war?
Are you asking me? I can answer.
Yeah.
I think it has worked in the past, but I think people are beginning to see that the claims made by Israel are just claims. They're just lies, misinformation, propaganda. That's all we could say. And there is a shift in opinion, particularly amongst the younger generation, and that's because they are using social media. They're able to see what's happening. They're mobilizing behind other terms and so on, but. Hasbara is still used, and it is supported by a lot of funding. In the UK, we have something called BICOM, which is a British-Israeli communication unit that was established about, I would say, 2016, with the purpose of flooding the public space and the media space in the UK with the pro-Israeli narrative. So we see a shift amongst the young people, but I think the older generation are much harder to shift in terms of their opinion.
Sahar, does this kind of video and others that came before it, including ones that you talked about, others that we referenced that were either debunked or that were, laughed at on social media and seen as either wildly inaccurate or completely staged, does that pose a problem for the U.S., which is the main supporter of Israel in this war at this stage? I mean, let's just remind our viewers, based on the U.S. veto at the UN Security Council just a few days ago, Israel is just one U.S. veto away now from not being able to prosecute this war as it's currently doing, right? So they need the U.S. to be on board. Does this create a PR problem for the U.S.?
I think it does, because the unconditional and one-sided support that the U.S. has been given Israel since the beginning of all of the events unfolding since October 7th has been really something that a lot of people have critiqued and blamed the U.S. for really being this staunch supporter of Israel when we have more than 18,000 lives lost in Gaza, most of whom are women and children and elderly people who are just plain civilians that have nothing to do with Hamas. So this really creates an image crisis for the United States and shakes its own reputation, credibility, and international leadership on the international stage. I also want to highlight the very important point, which is the double-edged sword of social media. Social media played a very, very important role in the midst of these events. I mean, on one hand, it really allowed the truth to come out in a way that was not possible through the mainstream American media or Western media in general, most of whom have adopted a narrative that's really, really very supportive of Israel all the way, and did not give a lot of room for showing the other side of the story, which is the suffering of the Palestinian people day in and day out. Therefore, the world consciousness was shocked when they started to see all of these images and videos coming out of Gaza. And they're like, oh my God, wait a minute. We are not seeing that on, traditional mainstream average Western media or American media, but we are seeing it now through social media. Social media played a very important role to create this kind of awakening of international public opinion, and we saw how that was reflected in massive demonstrations and protests and marches all over the world. One of them here in Washington, D.C. exceeded 500,000 people, which is unprecedented. On the other hand, however, social media had another side, which is a negative one, where it really became a platform for the spread of staged videos and in some cases misinformation or disinformation or propaganda, just like some of the footage and videos we have been talking about. So you have to bear in mind also this double-edged sword effect of social media and how it can have positive as well as negative consequences at the same time.
Marc, if we flip the coin, what has been Hamas's communication strategy? How have they countered the whether it's the videos or the messaging that we're seeing out of Israel?
Well, I think they've shifted over time. I think the initial attacks on October the 7th, you saw a sort of celebration of brutality, which obviously was, in terms of generating global sympathy, was entirely ineffective. But I think the thing is, Hamas, apart from putting out these occasional videos where you see spokesmen talking about what they've done and how much Israeli equipment they've destroyed, have attempted to kind of try and portray themselves in a more legitimate light. So we've seen Hamas spokesman conferences now with those advertising backboards. When we've had the hostage exchanges, we've also seen, a lot of narratives promoting this idea that Hamas have been humanely treating their hostages, whereas Palestinian prisoners of Israel have been really treated badly. So they've made a kind of lot of this, and now we're seeing more videos of Hamas, showing and documenting their attacks on Israeli tanks, again to show, Hamas is strong and won't be cowed. But I think generally over time, the need Hamas have to kind of counter Israel's points are not strictly that important. I mean, as Sahar said, and as Dina's mentioned, there's a lot of social media content coming out from journalists still in Gaza that show the absolute devastation that Israel's bombing has caused. I mean, when you have over 16,000 people killed, a huge number of which are children, then global sympathy is obviously going to be on your side. So Hamas actually don't need to do much, because when those videos are being put out, that is going to be the most effective form of persuasion that Hamas need. And so I think that's really important to remember when we talk about the propaganda war here. There's a certain asymmetry. And Hamas have benefited from the fact that Israel's brutal response has just generated so much anti-Israeli propaganda itself.
All right, that's all the time we have for today, but I'd like to thank all our guests for joining us. Sahar, Khamis, Marc, Owen, Jones, and Dina, Matar. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, our handle, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.